Hello there, welcome back to the channel. It's Richie here from Dawi After Dark. Today I wanted to talk about the royal clans and especially the list that I have been running at loads of tournaments. I think I've played this list about 7 times at events, and now people have started to pick up the list and use it in their own tournaments, and people have been doing really well with it. I just wanted to talk today about the 4 things that make the list tick, and also run through the tactics on how to play the list. Now, it's quite a techie army. You have to rely on the fact that your heroes are going to have to pull their weight, and also the fact that you only really have 2 units and a support piece. Now, it can be quite daunting running a list like this because you don't think that you have enough board presence. The fact that you can move your blocks around pretty quickly does really help kind of negate this. Plus the fact that your units can be very tanky if you can get the buffs off from the anvil. It's a very fun list to use. So the first pivotal thing about this list is the heroes. For those of you who haven't seen the list, it's an Anvil of Doom with the Master Rune of Adamant and the Rune of Spellbreaking. With the Master Rune of Adamant, the anvil becomes toughness 10. The key word on the rune says that the model gains toughness 10. This means that you would gain toughness 10 from shooting and in close combat. If it said bearer of the rune, then I would definitely say that it would just be the Forge Father and the crew. But because it says model, that means that it would go to both, which is absolutely amazing, which means that dragons are going to be wounding you on 6s. Most artillery in the game is also going to be wounding you on 6s as well, apart from Empire cannons. Now, those things are absolutely brutal because they will be wounding you on a 4. So a potential change going forward for this could be Preservation and then a couple of Runes of Fortitude. And then a Rune of Spellbreaking on there as well. If you don't know what the Rune of Spellbreaking means, basically it means it's an auto dispel that you don't have to roll for. You do unfortunately have to be in Wizardly Dispel range to be able to stop it, which on the anvil, because it dispels at level 3, is 24 inches, which is still pretty good. And I do quite like to take a spare Spellbreaking that's not just all on the Runesmith. It means if the Runesmith's in combat, then the anvil can sit back and stop a pivotal spell, which could definitely win you the game. The anvil for me is an insane tech piece, which the entire list is written around. With pretty much every single army in the game, there's going to be one model that you always start in a list. And for me in Royal Clans, it is always the Anvil of Doom. The fact that you can make a unit +1 save and reroll saves is absolutely amazing. Plus the move again is very pivotal to this list. And the magic missile having 27 inches isn't too shabby either. The 2 main things that I'm going to be using my anvil for is either holding flanks, holding the center, and then trying to get as many buffs off as possible during the game. As the anvil casts at level 3, the lower version of Oath and Steel only needs a 7, so that's not too bad to get on dice, so you can reliably get that. But the Rune of Oath and Steel, when it goes off on 11+, which then means that you need to roll a 7 on 2 dice, does mean that that unit is getting +1 save and reroll saves. You do really have to make sure that you're putting this on the right unit in that turn, but I will definitely get to that when I talk about the tactics of the list. Now, this list is a yeet list. What that means is the fact that the anvil can make a unit move twice. You combine that with drilled to get into marching column and a cart, and combine that with the Vanguard rune, and basically means that your 1 combat unit can move 27 inches turn 1. The way that you achieve this and basically blow people's minds because they can only think of dwarves moving 3 inches is basically by having the cart. The cart gives you +1 move, so suddenly you're movement 4. You go into marching column with drilled. I'll explain about that in the tactics part as well. But that means your marching column suddenly when you're moving 3 times is 12 inches. And don't forget with the Vanguard move, you get a 3-inch movement basically before the game starts. Unfortunately, the Vanguard move isn't changed by the cart. So you move up 3 inches, then you go into marching column, then you can move another 12. And then if the anvil buff goes off, suddenly you're moving another 12 inches, taking you up to 27 inches right in the opponent's face. Now, this is really good into gun lines or other armies that are going to sit back and basically try and blast you from afar. You're probably not going to want to do this into combat armies. But this is the whole point of the Anvil of Doom. And with the toughness 10, it can also anchor flanks and stop even dragons in their paces. Next up for me, which I think is one of the pivotal key pieces in this list, is the Runesmith BSB, which is a special BSB that you can only take in the Royal Clans list. Now, with the Runesmith, it does mean that it's not as tanky as a Thane BSB, but what that gives you is the fact you don't have to spend points on both. And that was something that was very important for me when I was coming up with this list. For this Runesmith build, I take Great Weapon, Full Plate Armor, Shield, Battle Standard Bearer, with the Master Rune of Grugni, the Rune of Battle, and 3 times the Rune of Spellbreaking. Now, the reason I take 3 runes of Spellbreaking on the Runesmith is the fact that if I'm playing against armies such as Mortuary Cult, there is 2 pivotal turns when I'm running at them that I need to try and stop their spells. And these become really, really important and can win you games. And unfortunately, you do need to time these really well. You can use them all in one phase. So if your opponent's shooting loads of hexes at you that you need to stop, then you can use them all in one go. But I would definitely suggest keeping at least one back so that then you can play a kind of mind games on your opponent, unless you really need to use them and it's going to win you the game. With the shield and the full plate armor, having the Gromril special rule as well, this gives the Runesmith a 3-up natural save rerolling ones. Now, if you combine this with, say, the anvil buff, suddenly you're going to be on a 2-up save, re-rolling everything. Then with the Banner of Grugni, you're also going to have a 5-up ward as well. Suddenly becomes quite tanky. This combined with the Rune of Battle that's in there as well, giving the unit +1 combat res, is absolutely amazing. I absolutely love this build. It does become quite tanky and actually quite difficult to deal with. Considering the fact it's only got a couple of wounds, people really struggle to be able to kill the Runesmith. It would definitely be nice if we could fit in a Rune of Preservation in there as well, but unfortunately I don't really have the points, and the fact it's only got 2 wounds as well, killing blow doesn't really make too much difference to it. Hopefully you're going to be challenging out those characters with your king anyway. The biggest downside of the Runesmith, unfortunately, is it does dispel at a level 1, and unfortunately what that means is that you only have an 18-inch range dispel, but if you have that in the unit that's being yeeted up the board, with the Vanguard move and the double move from the Anvil, suddenly that means that you're going to be right in your opponent's face and you're going to want to be able to stop those spells straight away. Now, this is a kind of a shock and awe tactic where you get right in your opponent's face and stop all of their magic. And it really, really does work. So next up is the real big heavy hitter in the list. Now this is the Dwarven King. He has marched himself out of his holds and is ready to take battle to the enemies and slaying those dragons and big gribblies. Now, at the beginning of the edition, everyone's saying that you're not going to want to take a king, and for me, I just ended up taking Thanes. And then once the Royal Clans come out and you can see the difference of the extra 25 points in runic allotment, then suddenly the king comes extremely viable. Now, the load up of king in this list is Great Weapon, Full Plate Armor, Shield Bearers, Master Rune of Smiting, the Master Rune of Gromril, Rune of Preservation, and the Rune of the Furnace. So the whole point to this key piece is to do challenges. You need to challenge out the biggest thing that you possibly can and absolutely destroy it. Now, this does go really well with the Ancestral Grudge, which is a special rule that the Royal Clans have, that you pick an enemy hero before the game starts and you gain an extra 75 VP if you kill that model by the end of the game. And also don't forget the fact that your entire army gets hatred versus that model, which suddenly means that you can play mind games from the beginning of the game. So if you pick an enemy hero that's going to have to charge into in combat, the opponent knows that you're going to have the upper hand fighting into that and also gain more points. Sometimes it can even mean that if you pick a dragon that's already really expensive, the opponent won't want to engage with you, which suddenly means that 700 VP dragon isn't coming anywhere near you, so then you can chew up the rest of the army. This is something that I really enjoy about the Royal Clans. You can play really good mind games with your opponents, as they are pretty scared of this king. He comes with a pretty buffed up 2-up save. The Rune of Preservation means that he can't be multi-wounded or killing blowed, which is absolutely insane. So suddenly those Dragon Lords with their Ogre Blades aren't doing that much to you at all. If you combine this defensive profile with the Master Rune of Grugni, because you're going to be keeping the 2 heroes together in the same unit, suddenly a 2-up save with a 5-up ward is very tanky. And then suddenly, if you combine that with the Anvil of Doom's buff, even just for rerolls, means that he's on a 2-up save, re-rolling everything with a 5-up ward. Now, most things in the game only have a maximum of normally AP2. So dragons would be AP2, and most great weapons are AP2 as well. Obviously, they can get higher, but the majority of the strong attacks in this game are AP2. That would mean that your king would be on a 4-up save, re-rolling everything with a 5-up ward. Suddenly, he is an absolute tank. I've managed to kill loads of dragons and probably only take 1 or 2 wounds in return. I think I've only lost my king a couple of times in the, I want to say 100 games or so that I've had with this list and various iterations of it. But the real scary thing about this king is the Rune of Smiting. The Rune of Smiting means that his attacks suddenly become D6 wounds. This is truly terrifying for multi-wound creatures. Now, if you can position him well and charge him into anything that's got multi-wounds, suddenly he becomes an absolute monster. Now, if you also pair this with the Forge Fire rule that the Runesmith has, then any 6 would become AP5. The reason for this is because the Forge Fire rule gives an armor bane of 2 on a 6. If you combine this with the Great Weapon, which already has AP2 and armor bane 1, suddenly AP5 on a 6 will rip through pretty much anything, reducing them to just their ward saves and regens. And if you can sneak one wound through and you roll that 6, suddenly you're probably definitely winning combat. For the heroes, I normally like to keep them together. There are definitely some matchups where you'd want to split them up. If something has a ward save against flaming, it's definitely worth popping the Runesmith out behind the unit before you engage, just so you lose those flaming attacks, because that can be a nerf which can lose you the game. Talking about ward saves against flaming, the Rune of the Furnace on this king is there for 2 reasons. The first reason, if you're playing against those cheeky Chaos Dwarves and need to stop those Tauruses, because they can be pretty scary actually. I did find that Chaos Dwarves are actually quite strong into our Dawi kin, but the real strong thing is because at the moment we are seeing a lot of Dwarf players out there, and the Rune of the Furnace does go into other Dwarf kings really well. So if you're in a mirror match and they don't have the Rune of Furnace, you are winning that battle. And you are going to be able to smash through their Dwarf King and win that game for your clan. I played probably about 100 games trying to get this list finalized. I tried it in various different iterations, tried it in versions without the king, with Thanes, with Doomseekers in the list, with different warriors in the core, different tactics going forward. But this is a list that I've settled on that works really well for points denial, works really well into monsters, and can pretty much smash face of any army in the game. Now, if you can combine this with some good tactics, this is a very, very strong list in my opinion. I know at the beginning of the edition, everyone was saying that dwarves are terrible. I genuinely think that they can become a terrifying force going forward in the old world. And I really hope that everybody enjoys using it. So the second pivotal thing in this list, which makes the entire thing tick, is the core. Now the core is the main basis of this list, which is a one massive Death Star of Longbeards. I personally like to run 28, and in that unit, I have hand weapons, great weapons, heavy armor, shields, drilled, elder with the Rune of Passage and the Rune of Furnace, the Standard Bearer with the Strollaz rune, the Rune of Battle and the Rune of Courage, and a musician. Now the reason for the Rune of Passage and the Rune of Furnace is pretty simple. So the Rune of Passage is going to stop you from losing any movement when you're moving through terrain, which is really, really important if you're really far away from the cart or the cart's dead, and that can really, really slow you down on charges. Also, if you're going through dangerous terrain, getting those rerolls on the ones is super handy. Considering your units are so condensed, you'd be surprised on how many ones you would end up rolling if you have to charge through a wood, which is always terrible for our Dawi brothers and sisters. The Rune of Furnace is on there in case he is a challenge with something with flaming weapons. So say if you're in another mirror match and you don't want to put your king into their king, offer up your unit champion, and then suddenly you've got a 3-up ward against those attacks that the king has. So that's definitely a fun little bit of tech in there, and that's the reason why the Rune of Furnace is in there. It's for playing against other dwarf lists. I know a few people online have been talking about why I've got that on him, but that's literally the reason, because you do end up playing against dwarves quite a bit in events because they are a very popular army now, which I am very, very happy about. The Strollaz rune on the banner is something that I talked about earlier. What this does is it gives the unit a vanguard move of 3 inches before the game starts. Now that is very, very strong. You could either move 3 inches forward or 1.5 inches back before your move, depending on what you need to go for. So say if a Hellblaster volley gun is vanguarded up forwards, then you could potentially vanguard backwards and then get out of range potentially. Or if you need to push forward into a gun line, then you can move forward and then move that 27 inches turn 1, as long as you can roll the spells. And just throw your units forward and try to stop all their magic, and then turn 2, charge into their lines and deliver some Dawi vengeance. The other runes that I like to take on this unit are the Rune of Battle, giving you an extra combat res, which does combine with the one on the BSB. The ruling for this is that they do stack, which is lovely, which suddenly means if this brick, if you have 2 ranks, then you get to that fabled combat res 7, which is the perfect number to be able to beat dragons in combat if you challenge them out with your unit champion. I mean, probably most of the time you're going to be challenging out with the king, because the king does have a much better chance to be able to kill the dragon back. But if you just want to sacrifice your unit champion, you can get to that combat res 7, which then matches what the dragon can possibly get to, because they can only get 6 points of overkill and then close order. What you are getting is close order, a standard, a BSB, a Rune of Battle on the BSB, a Rune of Battle on the standard, and then 2 ranks. So suddenly you get to 7 combat res, and then the musician breaks ties, so you win. And a lot of the time, because the unit's so big, you're going to be doubling out that dragon or that behemoth, and then you could potentially chase them down. The thing that everyone forgets is the fact that this game is a dice game. Now, the amount of times that that dragon has failed, fled, and then rolled a 3 on the run, and then my plucky little dwarves have managed to run 10 inches over the top, killing the dragon, has actually been quite a few times in events, and it's definitely won me games. So it can happen, and anything can happen in a dice game. You don't have to sit back and just think, well, a dragon's really fast, I'm never going to catch it. You never know. Another perk of taking the Royal Clans is the fact that when you charge over 3 inches or make any follow-up move, you get a +1 to your strength. Because your Longbeards start out at strength 4, suddenly if you're using your great weapons and you manage to charge into or follow up into a dragon that's lost combat, so say if that dragon fell back in good order and then you followed up into them, it doesn't matter how far that you followed up, because it's only on charges that have to be over 3 inches. Suddenly you are strength 7 with your great weapon. And also the fact that you can use drilled, which means you can expand your frontage by 5 every time that you either do a follow-up or do a move. Suddenly you can start expanding out and getting more and more attacks in. Something the monsters are pretty scared of is loads of strength 7 AP2 attacks coming into them, which can definitely tear through most things. I love this unit. It's so good, it's so versatile and so maneuverable as well. What I like to do with this unit is not start it in marching column unless I'm playing against something that doesn't really have any shooting. If there's cannonballs coming at you, you need to make sure that you give them as little models to be able to kill as possible. So with this unit, I like to start in either 10 wide or 11 wide. And then when I go into marching column, I can reduce my ranks by 5. Thus moving into marching column, because you are suddenly thinner than you are wide. So suddenly you have more ranks than file, and then you're in marching column. And then if you expand by 5 again when you charge, because drilled lets you change your frontage before you charge, charging out of drilled can really mess with people. So you throw your unit up, suddenly a bunch of angry dwarves are just charging towards the enemy. And this is something very interesting. You just need to make sure that you stick to those magic numbers with this unit. Try not to go too wide, because it will take you a couple of turns to be able to get back out of that position unless you do a full reform. But something that you really need to remember is the fact that when you do reforms or when you do drilled, you need to make sure that you have the movement to be able to do it. In the last FAQ, it said that no model can move double their movement, which means that if you're not by the cart, you only have 6 inches to play with. If you're by the cart, then you have 8 inches, which does make it a little bit easier for reforms and to redress your ranks. What I quite like to do in tournaments, just to make sure that it's nice and clean, and so the opponent knows what I'm doing, is to mark 6 inches from the back models, or 8 if I'm by the cart, just with dice so that they can see exactly where those models can move to, and then place them there so it's as clean and as intentional as possible so your opponent doesn't think that you're cheating. In the upcoming beginner's guide, I'm going to run through a detailed explanation on how to run drilled. So I won't talk about that too much now, but I just like to keep it clean so the opponent knows exactly what I'm doing. There are 2 different ways that you can run the Longbeards. You can have them running the great weapons when they get into combat, or you can have them with the hand weapon and shield. Unfortunately, if the combat does grind on for more than 1 turn, that includes give ground and fall back in good orders, you cannot change your weapon. So you are stuck with either great weapon or hand weapon and shield. So you really need to work out what you're going to go into and the best possible scenario for you. I don't like to commit personally unless I've got the +1 save and reroll saves onto this unit. Now that's definitely something to think about. So these Longbeards are going to be having a 3-up save, re-rolling everything with a 5-up ward if they use their hand weapon and shield. And then if they use their great weapons, then they're going to be a 4-up save re-rolling, which suddenly is very good. But you can get greedy and can only want to use the great weapons. And you kind of forget that your heroes are the ones that are going to be doing most of the work in the unit. So my best advice is not to be greedy, but if something has a terrible save and you think you're going to be attacking first, definitely go with the great weapons. If something fast coming at you that can do lots of damage, then go with the hand weapon and shield. Remember, if you manage to win combat, follow up, suddenly you're going to be at strength 5 with AP1 weapons, because they have the Gromwell weapon on their hand weapons, which isn't too shabby at all. So don't worry, even if you don't do loads of damage on the first round, you can always follow up and suddenly do quite a bit then. Unless something's got a really high save, then definitely just go in with the great weapons and try to do as much damage as possible. But that is definitely something that you need to consider when you are playing the game. If you're getting charged by something that has a really high initiative and it's probably going to do a lot of damage to you, then I would definitely go hand weapon and shield. But something like a gigantic spawn, you need the higher strength to be able to deal with that. There's lots of things to think about, but you've got this, right? The weapon skill 5 is also invaluable for when you're playing this unit. Suddenly, if something's weapon skill 4, you're hitting them on 3s. So if you are using your great weapons, you're hitting on 3s, wounding on 2s, and it suddenly makes the dice a lot more favorable in the favor of the Dawi. So you can settle a lot of grudges that way. Infantry into infantry, the Longbeards usually come out on top. which is great to see. The third thing that makes this army tick is the Iron Drakes. Every army needs some range support. Now, thankfully that these guys are very, very strong. They have a couple of special rules which really just kind of force multiply and make them very, very good. I like to take a big unit of these, so I've got a unit of 18 of them. So they have the Drake guns, full plate armor. They have drilled because I can take 1 per 1,000 points, which means I can take both of my units with drilled. An Iron Warden champion, which is upgraded to have the Trollhammer torpedo and Cinder Blast bombs, and then a standard bearer with the Rune of Courage. Now, the Rune of Courage is absolutely amazing. I take this on the Longbeards as well, and what this does is it means that you automatically pass fear and terror checks, which is there to make sure that if you get charged, you can always stand and shoot with these units. Now, if you haven't played with the Iron Drakes yet, I would definitely suggest it. They're probably one of my favorite units in the entire Dwarf book, and they just get even better in Royal Clans. There are 2 different ways I like to run the Iron Drakes. So you can either run them on the flank, which is going to be holding an entire flank by themselves, and then with the anvil behind them, so that if you fall back in good order, you can fall through the anvil and then the opponent is stuck in a toughness 10 anvil, which is very annoying for your opponent. That's something that I do quite like to do. But I do find most of the time they can actually hold a flank all by themselves with their 18-inch strength 5 AP1 and armor bane 2 shots. So these can tear through most things. Now, if you combine this with a special rule for quick shot, suddenly you can move and shoot with no penalty, and also combine this with Dwarven Crafted. So if the opponent is within their movement and charges you, you do not suffer any negatives. So what you can do is these reliably can hold an entire flank by themselves. So if you're getting multi-charged into the Iron Drakes, for instance, you would absolutely lever into the easiest to kill unit, get up that combat res and potentially win that combat. Something that I do quite like to do is if a unit is charging a chaff unit into me and a dragon, what a lot of people will try to do is send in a unit that has a champion with a dragon, so suddenly you can't challenge out that dragon. Now, I would do all of my stand and shoot into that unit, try to completely wipe the unit, get all of that combat res, and then challenge out the dragon with my unit champion. I know that the combat res isn't too high on the Iron Drake unit, but if you can do 5 or 6 wounds, you're winning that combat. So that's an interesting tactic that you can use. Also, definitely something to think about is where you're going to put those anvil buffs, because the Iron Drakes have got full plate armor. Suddenly, if they get the +1 save and rerolls, they do become very tanky. So what you can do is force people to charge into your King's unit. If suddenly you've buffed up your Iron Drakes, so they're on a 3-up save re-rolling, they think on a stand and shoot you're probably going to kill the unit that charges them. Suddenly they'll think better about that and charge into your Longbeards, which is definitely a trap because that's where the king is. In the Iron Drakes, the unit champion is a very key pivotal piece in this unit. Having the Trollhammer torpedo, which means at 24-inch range, he's got a strength 8 weapon, which is AP 3 and D3 damage. He is ballistic skill 5, so he's hitting up 2s, 3s for long range, and then 4s if he's moved as well, which is pretty reliable. Being strength 8 means that it's wounding most stuff on either 2s and 3s, and you can reliably try and do some damage, unless you roll like me and only ever roll 1s. Something that always happens to me is the fact that when I roll my dice, every time I shout Trollhammer, roll my dice, it's always a 1. Hopefully that doesn't happen to everybody out there, but that's just something that I seem to go through on every single time that I shoot him, which is slightly annoying. You'd think hitting on 2s and wounding on 2s, it would be horrendously reliable, but for me, I don't know. So a lot of the time, if something's close to me, I will always use the Cinder Blast bombs. Now, the Cinder Blast bombs are an amazing tech piece. These are D6 +1, strength 5, AP1 flaming hits. These can clear chaff. Just remember, if you've got 18 Iron Drakes shooting and then this as well, suddenly you can get loads and loads of hits, which does make this unit absolutely terrifying for lightly armored foes to try and charge into. Now, there is quite a big debate going on whether line hammer or not. I would personally only put these into a line of 18 if I was going to either try and guard an entire flank if the opponent had loads and loads of units. So say if you were playing against loads of scouting units or an Orcs and Goblin army or a Chaos army when there's just loads of models everywhere, I would probably deploy them in an angle down from me so they can cover an entire flank by themselves. I do quite like to run them in 2 ranks because they can all shoot at large targets, and most of the time you're going to be wanting to shoot them at large targets. I mean, if the enemy is rattling towards you with a unit of knights, you can use your drilled and expand out by 5 so you can get more shots out. Another thing you can do is keep them in 2 ranks and have them on a hill because both ranks will be able to shoot. So if you're playing pretty defensive, defensive and you don't want to take up loads of room, then putting them on the hill is probably a good way to go with them as well. The reasoning for me going for the smaller frontage is it just makes them a little bit more maneuverable, and if I need to drop down into marching column to be able to move them up the board quickly, then you can do that as well. If you are in a really ungainly wide line, then you can't be very maneuverable at all, and it does make them quite hard to use. Yes, if you're defending, that's really good, but if you're going to be on the attack, then you want to have a smaller frontage to be able to get up there faster. And also being able to shoot at large targets in 2 ranks really helps with that as well. Something to consider with the Iron Drakes is the fact that they have a 5-up ward save against flaming. So if you're playing against a Chaos Tzeentch army, for instance, and all of their spells are flaming, I like to put these guys at the front to try and weather the storm and take the first lot of wound from all of Tzeentch's fire and all those fireballs as the rest of my army pushes up, because usually they are pretty scared of a big unit of Iron Drakes coming towards them. Now, if you've got the Anvil buff on them as well, then suddenly they do get quite a good save against this. A 3-up rerollable save against Fireball is very, very strong, and then a 5-up ward save just from their armor is great as well. The only downside that I think the Iron Drakes have is the fact that their attacks are flaming. Unfortunately, this means that armies that have got a ward save against flaming, they do kind of struggle to do that much too. Like the White Cloak that the Empire has, for instance, with a 3-up ward save against flaming. The Chaos Dwarves as well also can have a 3-up ward save on the Taurus, which is very, very strong. And then also into opponents' Iron Drakes. Something that I would suggest that if you're in a mirror match, do not shoot the Iron Drakes, shoot the Longbeards or anything else that's coming at you. Iron Drakes into Iron Drakes I've done many times before, and if you've seen my videos before playing into Andy 2d6, then Iron Drakes do not do anything into other Iron Drakes, which is actually pretty funny because they just do not want to hurt other dwarves. The fourth thing in this list, which basically ties everything together, are the support pieces. Support pieces that I like to run are the Grudge Thrower and the Cart. The Cart is there for obvious reasons, to give the units +1 to move, but it does also fulfill another role. Now, what this role is basically makes the entire list legal, because you need 3 units and they cannot be comprised of heroes or artillery. So suddenly, if you don't have that Cart, the army isn't legal. So you do definitely need that Cart in, plus being able to give the combat units +1 move, and also onto the Iron Drakes giving them +1 move, does mean that you suddenly can be very, very offensive. When you're playing into gun lines or a mortuary cult list, it's just going to sit at the back of the board and pelt you from afar. You really, really need the agency to be able to push forward. Plus, the Grudge Thrower is there to be able to extend your hand and deal damage from afar. Yes, the statistics of them hitting isn't very good, but you will occasionally get a direct hit, and that direct hit will be satisfying. Being Strength 8, AP 3 and then D3 +1 damage, it does mean that the opponent has to think about what they're doing. They just can't hide heroes around or put a wizard right in front of their lines to be able to blast you, and it forces your opponents to make mistakes. Now, they are probably not the best artillery piece, but I absolutely love them because of the Bombard rule. Basically, Bombard means that you can shoot something you can't see. So if you've managed to whittle a unit of knights, say, down to 1 knight left, and it's run away from you and gone and hid behind a wood or behind a hill, but you can try and kill it, which can win you games. Remember, if you don't kill that last model, you're not getting full points and you're only getting 25%. Being able to get that full unit is really, really important. Yeah, it's fine. You might not hit most of the time, but that one time that you hit will be really, really good. For me, targeting stuff with the Grudge Thrower for the first couple of turns, it's really important with what you want to choose to go into. Now, the target acquisition for this is really different game to game, but I personally like to go after support pieces. So say if I'm playing into Mortuary Cult and they have a casket, I would try and lever into that and destroy that turn 1 or turn 2 if I can. Another thing to go for is those big Gribblies that don't have that good of a save. So you don't want to try and hit and stuff with that as multi-save so that you can make the D3 +1 damage really count. So gigantic spawns, the Grudge Throwers are really, really good into, plus things with bigger bases as well, because you have more of a chance that if you do scatter, you can still hit them. If you hit into a dragon base and you do scatter diagonally 2 inches, you still hit them. If you're playing into the undead and those big dragons, a little bit of a scatter can still hit them, which is absolutely crazy. That does go for ogres as well, but I don't think ogres are in kind of the best place. Sorry, Jack Cropper. Unfortunately, the Grudge Thrower at my last couple of events has decided to abandon me. I didn't really get any hits through, but when I did, they did really count. When I played against Ed Fawcett, I did manage to absolutely finish off a couple of units with the Grudge, and that's exactly what they're there for. They're not there to hit all the time, they're there to force your opponent to make mistakes, and then kill the solo guys running around or destroy the tech pieces. Now, if you can make your opponent make mistakes, you are on the upper foot. So a deployment that I quite like to do is keeping my iron drakes on my anvil in a wood. So if enemies that charge into them, they have to take the reduced movement, and also they have to use the smallest dice when charging into them, which means that you could potentially get another turn, blast them. So I like to keep the iron drakes onto one flank with the anvil kind of propping up the center, and then my combat units over to the other side. As long as you're playing into a combat army, then that is quite a strong way to go. Something that you really need to consider as well is the fact that you need to pin your flanks. Something you can do as well, you need to make sure that you don't get reared or anything charge into your flank as well. So you need to make most use of buildings, impassable terrain, or other features that are going to save you on the battlefield. Unfortunately, if you are being hyper aggressive, then you can't really plan for this. But if you can try and work out the best possible angle to charge into your opponent, then that is definitely something that's going to help you in those games. For me, one of the biggest things with this list is the target acquisition and what you try to deal with first. For me, I think it's really, really important that you take out the strongest unit or the strongest character that the opponent has right at the beginning of the game, because suddenly they're going to be on the back foot. Normally at events or at home games, there's going to be two main threats normally. Sometimes there's three, sometimes there's four, but there's normally two main threats. So there'll be like a dragon and a big unit of knights, which are going to be quick, punchy, and also tanky. Now, what I would do is I would use all of my shooting to try and thin down the knights, get as much damage into them as possible, so suddenly you render them inert, then send my Longbeard's unit into the dragon, thus neutralizing the two biggest threats right at the beginning of the game. You don't really have to worry about chaff too much with this list, because the anvil with its 2d6 strength 4 AP2 shots with a magic missile will manage to deal with that quite well. And if you do need to kind of thin them out, the iron drakes are there for that. But you need to concentrate on taking those big threats out early on. If you can kill their main threats in the first or second turn, then suddenly you are winning that game. And that is definitely the best way to play it. With your Longbeards using drilled, marching up the battlefield, you can be very tempted to slip into Linehammer. I actually wouldn't suggest this. The main problem with slipping into Linehammer is it takes too long to try and get back out of it, and you suddenly lose all of the maneuverability. What I like to do is start about 10 or 11 wide, so that I can do my shuffling around, get into marching column and that. Then suddenly if you charge out of marching column, you expand back up to 10 or 11, depending on what you wanted your marching frontage to be. And then you fight, hopefully win combat, expand out by another 5. And that's probably as wide as I ever like to go. The only times that I would potentially go wider than this is that if a different unit is fleeing, and then you can drill out by an extra 5 on top of that, as long as you have the movement in your unit, and then try and clip units that are fleeing that you could potentially overrun into. But that is potentially the only time that I would go wider than that. Plus, nobody likes the look of Linehammer, right? So those are all the main things in this list that make it tick. Now, a couple of minutiae things are going to be challenges with your king. When to accept, when not to accept, and when to just hit forwards. Now, if the opponent offers out a unit champion, then you do not want to accept with your king. The reason for this is that multi-damage weapons do not affect unit champions. Yes, the overkill does, but the multi-wound part of it doesn't. Now, a 4-attack king with 3 attacks from the shield bearers probably could do enough to get you a good overkill on that champion, but you probably don't want to risk it and just want to hit into the rest of the unit. So that would be a case where you, if they offered out with their champion, you would probably accept with your champion, hoping that your champion can kill theirs. Then your king could do work onto the unit, whittling down their numbers. If the unit champion has multi-wounds, just like a Shartak, then go for it, get your king in there and do as much damage as you possibly can. Your king is there to deal as much damage as possible. So he's there for the big monsters, for the dragons, and for any kind of big creature. An interesting tactic that you can use as well is by kind of moving your Longbeard unit around, making sure that your king is in the center of the unit so he has a bit of wiggle room to go either side. Now, offering out a flank charge to a big gribbly. This is a fun little tactic that I quite like to use because of the move through the ranks rule. So if you're not engaged in the front, then your heroes can move to your flanks if you're engaged in them. Now, I would say that a big gribbly, such as a gigantic spawn or a gorgon or anything, if it's going to charge into the Longbeards, it's always going to pick a point where it isn't in base contact with your king. But if it charges your flank and you've got enough movement to get there, then the king can just stroll up and absolutely slap into that monster. So they think they're getting a good deal going into your flank, whereas your king is basically just happy to himself that he's going to get the kill. So that's a fun little tactic for you to try. So the biggest drawbacks of this list, the anvil is immovable. Now that is a massive drawback because the buffs only have a 24-inch range. So an enemy can sit back even further, wait for you to be out of range, and then suddenly they can start killing your unit. So you do have to play quite aggressively with the anvil, putting it right on the front line. That's normally how I like to play it. Unless you're playing against Empire with great cannons, then hide that thing behind a building so it can't get shot. That's probably the best advice I'm going to give you on this video. But saying that, in most cases, being toughness 10, you're going to want to deploy it right on the line so that you've got longer and longer to be able to get those buffs out. And also, going off the fact that it can't move, opponents can basically just move their wizards into dispel range and then stop you. But that does mean that they are also in dispel range for your runes of spell breaking. So if you can stop their spells, it doesn't matter too much if you're getting your spell stopped, because they've got a 300 or 400 point wizard, which has basically been absolutely neutered. So that is definitely something to think about. So you kind of got to take the rough with the smooth with the anvil. It is an amazingly important tech piece, but it can get shut down quite easily. You need to fan out with your Runesmith in front of your anvil, basically to create a null zone of 18 inches. So enemy wizards do not want to get within 24 inches of that anvil because they want to stay out of 18 of the Runesmith, or you're just going to stop them. Another kind of drawback is knowing when to yeet or when to sit back and defend. So for me personally, if you're playing into a combat army, it's best to just kind of hunker down in a corner, set yourself up in a wood, or potentially set yourself up next to a building so the opponent can't just get around you, get behind you, and then wait for that charger to come, do as much stand and shoot as possible, and then counter charge, and then do your follow-up moves, and then destroy them. But if you're playing into a gun line that's sitting back, then you're going to have to run forward. That is the beauty of this list. It can do both really well. You can defend really well, and you can also charge into the enemy and destroy them. The main part of this list is the fact that it doesn't give out many points. So the opponents can kill loads of Iron Drakes, or they can kill loads of Longbeards, and it's still not that many points they can get from you. A lot of games you'll finish and only really the cart and the grudge thrower has been killed, and they might have 25% of the Iron Drakes, but then you've destroyed most of their army. So suddenly you've won the game massively on points. I finished loads of games at events where the game has seemed really, really close. Then suddenly when you're totting up the points cost at the end, it's a 20-0 because they haven't managed to get many points out of you. This type of list is definitely a points denial list, and it works really, really well for that. But you do really need to think about what you're shooting, where your king's going, and where the combat's going. I've spoke all video about the fact that the king and the Runesmith go into the Longbeards. There are a couple of exceptions on that. And for me personally, I think that when you're playing into Bretonnia, what I like to do is put the king and the Runesmith into the Iron Drakes, because suddenly that is going to be the most pivotal unit in the game. The stand and shoots, and having the king and the ward save in there, because the Bretonnians probably aren't going to want to charge into the Longbeards anyway, but what they'll try and do is pick up the Iron Drakes. So suddenly if you've got your killy character in there, then that becomes a real problem for the Bretonnian players. So the last bit of fun little tech that I kind of want to impart onto everyone is keeping your units relatively close together. So if you can keep your Iron Drakes close enough to your Longbeards that the characters have enough movement to be able to pop into the other units, then suddenly, no matter where the opponent's sending their strongest unit, your characters can get into that unit and swap them backwards and forwards. This is a really, really nice tactic, and definitely something that you should all use, because your opponent is more likely to try and charge into the unit that doesn't have the killy king in. So if you can swap them around, there's suddenly no good charges. I hope that you've all been absolutely loving playing this Royal Clans list. I absolutely loved using it. It's really fun, and it's probably one of my favorite lists that I've used in any Warhammer game. It really feels to me like a real dwarven army. The fact that it's running forwards and dealing loads of damage in combat and also has some range capability. For me, it feels like a real dwarven army. Now, saying that, I am going to be using the X-Force going forward and running a load of gyros, so that's going to be quite different on the tabletop, but I am looking forward to playing it. So thank you very much everybody for watching, and I hope you enjoy using the Royal Clans. I would just like to say a massive thank you to my channel members, and I really, really appreciate it that you are all supporting the channel, and I hope that you enjoy all of the videos. Thank you very much to Magic Machek, Close Order, Tim Pitcher, Tom Boller, Wasted 13, Anthony Cruz, Voltan Ignacio, Mako 1981, Omega Minus, Moyax, Iron Bear Clan of Karakathul, Medium Matt, Sakuda, Morpheus 23, Niles the Batman, Anvil of Doom, Grundadrak, Ginger Steve, Donakopf, Will 1228, Roll the Initiative Gaming, Jack Ryan, Elder, and Michael Stewart. Thank you so much to all of my members, and thank you to my new channel members as well. I hope you've enjoyed the video, and I will see you on the next one. A rockin' stone. Goodbye.
In the night of stone we march so bold, with our sharp and heart so cold. Through halls of old our vengeance sparks in shadows dark. It's Dawi after dark. For years untold and legends kept, where blood runs cold in caverns deep. The drums they roar will settle scores in Dawi lore. The grudge is held for years untold, in legends kept where blood runs cold. In caverns deep the drums they roar will settle scores in Dawi lore. Under mountains watchful gaze will end the feuds of ancient days. With iron will and spirit stark, will bring the light in Dawi after dark. Golden gems shall guide our fight through endless tunnels lost tonight. The hammer falls, the anvil sings, in Dawi's name our battle rings. From molten forges fury red, our enemies shall quake with dread. In caverns grim our legends start, we strike as one in Dawi after dark. Under mountains watchful gaze will end the feuds of ancient days. With iron will and spirit stark, will bring the light in Dawi after dark. Under mountains watchful gaze will end the feuds of ancient days. With iron will and spirit